Hey, it's Mika. About exactly 2 years ago, I messaged a bunch of my favorite authors from around different fandoms and asked if I could have blanket permission over their works. And the reason was, back then I used to post a lot more regularly, and I did miniseries. They were short-lived, but the whole purpose of them was to celebrate some of my favorite authors who don't necessarily have the word count to make up fully fledged videos. And I would love to keep doing stuff for them, and there were a lot that I never got around to doing. And so this is my solution. I'm going to pick an author that I really, really like, and once in a while I'm just going to read some of their short stories for you, and call them a collection, similar to how I did for Faithwood recently. I hope you guys enjoy these shorter snippets of stories and stuff, and I'll try and keep them pretty consistent in theme and warnings. Anyway. Draco's Personal Saviour by Ladderofyears. Read by Mika. Draco came back to himself slowly, like he was swimming to the surface of the Black Lake. His vision was blurry, and his head ached like he'd been hexed. It took him a minute to realize where he was. The poster of Appleby Apples and his favorite photo of Mum and Dad that adorned the wall of his Slytherin dorm were missing from the front of his bed. It was only when the starchy scent of the sheets assailed his senses, cut through with the rank stink of potions, that Draco knew. Mullen's bloody teeth! He was in the hospital wing! Draco threw himself back on hard cotton pillows. He couldn't believe it. How on Cersei's green earth had he ended up here? It wasn't like the time when he'd been attacked by the ruddy great hippogriff. Draco could remember those events well enough. The panic on the face of that great oaf Hagrid. The strength of the giant's arms as he'd been hoisted up into the air, as though he weighed little as a feather. Draco remembered how he'd enjoyed the fuss of the medical staff, and what a big deal he'd made of the events for weeks afterwards. Today, though, Draco had no idea how he'd managed to get himself so bruised and battered. Gingerly, Draco stretched out his arms and legs. They were achy, bruised for certain, but nothing hurt like it was badly broken. That was a small mercy. He loathed the taste of that repulsive skelegro. Draco focused the thoughts in his throbbing brain and screwed his eyes tightly shut. He couldn't be too badly injured. If that was the case, they'd have flew him to St. Mungo's. Draco didn't think that he'd been hit by a hex or a curse either. There wasn't the telltale prickling under his skin that always came alongside other people's magic. Had it been a potions accident? Draco tried to remember his last lesson down in the laboratory. Slughorn had been at the front, droning on excitedly, his jowls wobbling with every word he spoke. No, that hadn't even been a blasted practical lesson. Their class hadn't done anything more exciting than a practice nude exam. Draco's eyes shot open, realization flooding through him. He'd been flying! That was it. That was how he'd gotten injured. Everything was beginning to come back to him. He'd taken out his new clean sweep Razorback 500 out early, just as the dawn rose over the Scottish mountains, and it had been heavenly. A warming spell had kept the worst of the chill from his bones, but Draco had still felt the ice bite of it stinging his skin. He'd felt the breeze rippling up his hair. Up in the empty air, he was just Draco. He wasn't a marked ex-Death Eater. He wasn't a prior. Draco remembered that he'd been really enjoying himself. He'd run a few Quidditch drills, but Draco remembered that he'd soon gotten bored of those. He'd taken to diving and swooping, and he'd felt free, properly free, in a way that he'd only ever did in the sky. And then Draco felt his cheeks flooding with mortification. He had been flying, high about the castle, but he hadn't been alone. There'd been another wizard there alongside him. Another wizard who had spied the crisp beauty of the morning and who had shared Draco's brilliant idea. There'd been another wizard craving the very same freedom. Draco's memories were assaulted by visions of jade-green eyes, sparkling in the winter sunlight, and black, untamable hair. Draco remembered that the two of them had been racing. They'd been trying to outdo each other's feats of daring, of audaciousness, and then... "Madam Pomfrey! Madam Pomfrey, I think Draco's awake!" cried the voice of Harry Potter, clear and loud in the silence of the hospital wing. "I'm getting out of bed," Potter continued, assaulting Draco's eardrums with his noise. "I'm going to go check on him." Draco heard the rustle of sheets from 2 beds down, and then the clump of heavy footsteps across the stone floor. In only seconds, Potter was stood beside his bed, as large as life and twice as gorgeous. Draco turned his head slowly, very slowly. His neck was dreadfully sore, and found Harry's eyes with his own. They were wide, guileless, and full of genuine concern. "Oh, thank Marlin you're awake," Potter said. "You gave me a bloody fright when you came off your broomstick, Malfoy. You're okay now, though. I never thought I'd be so happy to see your scowling face. There were a few seconds where I thought you were off to meet your maker this morning." Draco half wished that he could have met his maker. Death, surely, would have been preferable to having Harry Potter as his own personal saviour. For a single mad moment, Draco thought about apparating away, but soon gave up on that idea. His wand was still beside his bed in the dungeon, and the spell wouldn't work on the grounds of Hogwarts. Draco made a small groan, half with pain and half with the realization that he actually needed to reply. Potter's eyes widened at the sound. "Malfoy, you're in pain and I'm stood here rambling. I'm sorry," he uttered, furrowing his eyes with obvious dismay. "I'm just happy you're in one piece. When you fainted sliding off your broom, and then you actually slid off, I couldn't believe my eyes." Draco wished that he could sink into the bedsheets and never be found again. Luckily, he was saved from having to make a grovelling thank you by the arrival of Madame Pomfrey at his bedside. The witch held a smoking vial of milky purple potion in her hand, and she placed it carefully onto Draco's bedside table. "You gave us all a nasty fright, Mr. Malfoy," she said, casting a series of diagnostic spells as she spoke. Draco watched as the multicolored lights flickered between Potter and he, and then slowly faded back into the ether. "I must say I'm surprised at you," Madame Pomfrey continued, making a tusking noise. "Slipping off your broomstick like a fledgling first year. Thank Godric that Mr. Potter was here to save the day once again. If it hadn't been for that speedy cushioning charm that he cast, you wouldn't have been alive to have this conversation, young man." Madame Pomfrey gave Draco's forearms an investigating squeeze, before she continued speaking. "All your injuries are healing beautifully. You should be able to leave very soon." Her expression softened, and her eyes flicked over to Potter. "You're a lucky wizard to have such a dedicated boyfriend, Mr. Malfoy. I'll have you know he carried you all the way here himself." "I actually used a levitating charm," Harry cut in, his voice decidedly more squeaky than it had been before. "I didn't carry him as such. And there wasn't a thing I could do to convince him to leave you. He waited diligently for you to wake, and wouldn't even leave when lessons began. In the end, I was forced to have him lay on the other bed, so he wouldn't be under my feet." Draco wondered if he had woken up into a parallel universe. It was entirely possible. He'd already lived through a war and shared a home with a homicidal dark wizard. He had no idea of the depths of insanity that his life could potentially plunge to. "You're mistaken, Madame Pomfrey. Harry's not my boyfriend," Draco croaked. "We're scarcely even friends." Madame Pomfrey gave a sympathetic smile and picked up the vial of potion. She placed it into Draco's hands. "Of course, dear. Now, it seems your fractures have all healed and your bruising is fading nicely. If you'll please just drink this muscle restorative potion, then you'll be on your way after 1 hour of observation." Draco swallowed the smoky purple potion. It really tasted truly wretched. Madame Pomfrey watched him finish every drop, and then she departed, giving Potter a final nod and a smile. Truth be told, Draco didn't think he'd ever been this humiliated. He remembered the time that Potter and his golden charms had turned him into a giant slug-like creature. That hadn't been as embarrassing as having Potter stood in silence beside him. Draco remembered detentions, Quidditch losses, and even getting bitten on the leg by one of his family peacocks. All of those occasions paled in comparison to this very moment. He forced himself to look at his personal saviour. Potter's face was as red as his own. "I suppose I should say thank you," Draco muttered, putting on his best aristocratic drawl. "Saved by the Chosen One himself. There's many a wizard that would be overjoyed with such an experience, despite the vile potions, the concussion, and the bruises that came alongside it." Potter's reaction to his insolence wasn't anything like Draco might have imagined. Instead of being angry, Potter simply laughed. "I suppose that you're correct," Harry said, taking off Draco's stilted, unnatural tone. "But if I'm really honest, I don't give a stuff about any of those other wizards. I'm the one that's overjoyed, because you're fine, and back to your flinty old self." Draco felt the familiarity of a sarcastic reply bubble in his throat. He supposed that he ought to tell Potter that it was his fault he was stuck in the hospital wing. If the glittering git hadn't been showing off on his fashionable new nimbus, then Draco wouldn't have gotten so distracted that he slid off his own broomstick. Draco supposed he ought to tell Potter to get back to the Weasel and insufferable Granger, that the two should be pining for his presence by now. Draco didn't say either of those things, though. He didn't want Potter to leave. Somehow, be it magic or just Gryffindor intuition, Potter seemed to read his mind. The other wizard pulled up a chair and sat down, casting a speedy tempest to count down the hour that Draco needed to stay in bed. After a few minutes of small talk, Potter suddenly got a cheeky glint in his green eyes. "I've got a special request for you, Malfoy," Harry said. "Something I'd only ask of someone whose life I saved." Draco snorted his derision. "I don't owe you a bloody life debt," he quickly replied. "If you had actually listened during History of Magic, then you have known they'd been illegal since 1756. "I was a bit busy during my school days," Harry interrupted, laughing once again. "No, not a life debt. Something even more powerful." He paused then, making a deliberate ploy to build up the tension between them. "I've got one little rule I live by. I insist that everyone whose life I've saved has to call me Harry. So that will be my reward. I'd like you to call me by my given name." With that, the wizard stuck out his hand. It hovered in the air between them. "Harry Potter," he said. "Pleased to make your acquaintance." Draco, trained since he was naught but a tiny child in decorum and the proper way to do things, took Harry's hand without a second thought. It wrapped around his own. It was calloused, terribly warm and tinkled with potent magic. An unconscious shiver rolled across Draco's skin. "Draco," he answered. "And thank you. You saved my life, He gulped. "You saved my life, Harry." Harry grinned. "And it wasn't even the first time, Draco. We're making a habit of this." Draco didn't reply. He only nodded, wondering when he was actually going to wake up from this dream. Part of Draco hoped that he never would. The wild-haired wizard quietened for a moment and picked a loose thread from the cuff of his tatty woolen jumper. "I think, perhaps, that we need to make new habits, Draco," Harry said. "Make new memories. Madame Pomfrey thought we looked like boyfriends. Would you like to go on a date with me? See if we could make it a reality." Draco's heart raced in his chest. This must surely be a dream. This was too good to be his life. Draco looked deeply into Harry's eyes, but there wasn't any hint of deceit in them. The other wizard wasn't having his fun with him or joking around. Harry was in earnest. "Yes," Draco said quietly. "Yes, of course. I'd like that." Harry nodded. "That's wonderful," he said, his face gentle. "When I watched you lying there, your face all pale, your eyes closed, all I could think was that I didn't want to lose you. There's nobody quite like you, Draco. Nobody at all." Harry seemed to brighten after a moment. "What shall we do for our date?" he asked. Draco thought about it for a minute. "Take me flying on your broomstick," he replied. "But hold on to me tightly." Expecto Patronum by Ladderofyears. Read by Mika. Magic had always been effortless for Draco. He'd felt the shiver of it flow through him since he was a child. Father had said his talent was because of his pure, fuelless blood, but Draco had known better. Draco had known that magic was part of him, as necessary as his bones, or his heart. Charms had been simple, easy things. Feathers had floated for him, and locks had clicked open. Transfiguration had been trickier, but Draco had soon mastered the basics. He'd gotten good marks in defense, in anatomy, and in potions too. Draco had been arrogant about it, proud and self-important, but beneath all his bravado he'd been grateful. He was a wizard, part of a rarefied few, and Draco wouldn't have known how to exist otherwise. It was only in his 8th year, after the war, after Father's conviction and the collapse of everything that Draco had once believed as truth, that a spell had beaten him. Expecto Patronum. It was an ugly experience for Draco, emasculating and mortifying. The rest of his class had cast the enchantment with little trouble. Indeed, many had already known this spell for years, his boyfriend Harry among them. Even Pansy managed after a couple of tries. Not Draco, though. Expecto Patronum had defeated him. However carefully he angled his wand, however hard he focused his favourite memories, how much he wanted this, shouted it like he meant it, nothing happened for him. All that Draco's wand would produce was a silvery wisp of mist that glittered for a moment, before vanishing into nothing. There was no Patronus, and no prospect of one. Harry, wonderful boyfriend that he was, took pity on Draco, and he offered to practice with him in an empty classroom. His help didn't seem to make a whole sickle of difference, though. Draco growled, full of dissatisfaction and frustration, slicing his wand through the chilly January air. "Expecto Patronum!" Draco shouted, again and again, until his voice was raw and cracked. "Expecto Patronum!" Still, nothing happened. If anything, the mist was even thinner and more miserable than it had been on Draco's previous few attempts. The few silver sparkles soon disappeared, and Draco slumped against a desk, his heart racing with humiliation and defeat. Magic had always been his one true faith. It had never let him down before, and that it was doing so now, in front of Harry, too, felt devastating in a way that he couldn't quite articulate. Somehow, he felt like less of a person. Draco felt his cheeks burn with a hot humiliation, and he refused to lift his eyes to meet Harry's own. "It's a really advanced spell," Harry said, from across the room, his voice obscenely soft in the quiet classroom. "There are lots of wizards that struggle with it, Draco. It's not shameful or..." Draco couldn't stand to hear that. He whirled around, cutting Harry off mid-flow. "Piss off!" Draco glowered, hating how kind and concerned Harry looked. His boyfriend's green eyes were soft with concern and care. Draco felt some of the heat leave his voice. "There might be lots of wizards that struggle with it, but you've never been one of them, Harry. What was it you told me? Oh, yes, Lupin taught me the spell when I was 13. 13, Harry! I'm nearly 18, and I can't do a spell that was mastered by a bloody child." Draco rolled his eyes so hard they nearly hurt. "I loathe you, Harry Potter. Of all the wizards in the world, I had to fall for you, Mr. Glittering Saviour." Harry hopped down from the desk where he'd been perched, and strode over to stand beside Draco. He didn't seem affronted by Draco's half-baked insults. "You don't loathe me," Harry laughed. "You love me. You told me so just the other night when we met in the astronomy tower. We were cuddled under a blanket, and..." Once more, Draco felt the need to interrupt Harry. He couldn't have the wizard derail their practice with the talk of love. They'd only start kissing, and then Draco would be distracted. He would never learn this blasted bugger of a spell. "I was there too," Draco reminded him. "So I don't need to hear your gabbing, Harry Potter. You're here to support me with learning to cast a Patronus. No need to change the subject." Harry smiled. "Pity," he replied. "I was rather hoping to hear you say it again." He cast his eyes over Draco's still half-raised arm, and seemed to come to a decision. Draco watched as Harry began to move a couple of desks out of the way to clear a space. Then Harry looked across at him again, those same green eyes now full of vigor. "All right then, Draco. Let's do this. I can see that this is something really important to you, and I want to be there for you. Show me once more how you cast the spell." Draco focused, tearing his eyes away from his boyfriend. Harry was terribly attractive when he got into his teaching mode, all excitement and direction, and Draco's body automatically reacted to the energy of him. Centering himself, Draco focused all of his magic to a pinprick point of power. He knew that happy memories were the spark that ignited the spell, so Draco let them rush through his brain and coil through his blood. He held out his wand in the perfect position as he murmured the incantation and closed his eyes tightly. Expecto Patronum. It didn't work. All Draco got were the same wisps of light that he'd gotten before, and the same few sparkles. He felt his heart sink down into his shoes. Even with Harry stood beside him, the spell still wouldn't work. Draco felt like half a wizard. Beside him, Harry raised an eyebrow beneath his ridiculous wire frames. It isn't your casting, Harry said, critical eyes taking in every element of Draco's posture. Your technique is flawless, and there's no doubt that you want it enough. We can solve this. I think I know what the problem might be. Draco looked at Harry, feeling downcast. I'm glad one of us does, Draco said glumly, because I've got not a single clue. I have no idea why this spell is so hard for me. I can feel the enchantment flowing through me. It's a pulse, a heat, but that isn't enough. Then it must be your memories, Harry said, his voice infused with urgency. Memories are the only key to unlocking your Patronus. What do you think about? Harry demanded. I need to know. Tell me everything. Draco's face flamed red. Father, letting me to try brandy when I received my Hogwarts letter, Draco said, the words falling from his mouth in a hurried rush. How he'd said I'd make my family proud, learning I was a prefect. The first time I flew on my broomstick, when you asked me to Hogsmeade and held my hand as we walked. You, every good memory of my life. They aren't enough, though, Harry replied, his hand reaching out and clutching Draco's forearm. The purpose of a Patronus isn't just to cast a creature. It isn't some childish charm. A Patronus is a shield, Draco. It's a positive force. The reason a Patronus alone can defeat a Dementor is that it projects hope, happiness, and love. Everything that makes us human. Everything that a Dementor isn't. Your memories, they're fine. They're grand, but that's all they are. Memories. The emotions associated with them, I'm just not sure they're strong enough. Draco felt despair. He couldn't answer that. He loved Harry, loved him down to his very bones. If that wasn't enough, then what possibly would be? So, what do you think about? Draco shot back, flailing, defensive, hating how his voice broke on the very last word. Harry answered without a blink of hesitation. I think about you, Harry said, moving a step closer. I think about the expression on your face when I first asked you out. You were wary, Draco. Your eyes darted. You were scared that I was having fun with you, having some joke, but you still agreed. You still said yes. I think about When I'm with you, I'm not the chosen one. I'm not the Saviour. I think about how you love me despite all of what's happened between us, and how you always have. Harry paused, and he swallowed. And I think about how lucky I am. How I might have lost Sirius and my parents, but that I found you while we were both still young. We've got all the years of our life together, and I'm grateful, Draco. I'm so grateful for that. Draco didn't know what to say. He hadn't the words in his vocabulary. Harry's words echoed through Draco's mind, the raw honesty of them, and then Draco imagined what their together might be like. Draco imagined a cottage with crisp white sheets across their bed. He imagined neat rows of herbs. They'd spend long days in their garden, a light breeze ruffling their hair and the sun pinking the tips of their noses. I think about you. Harry, who'd never known what it was to have a family. Harry, who'd been used and exploited by the very people who were supposed to care about him. Harry, who was the very best of them, wanted to share the rest of his life with him. I think about you. Draco felt humbled by Harry's simple words. His chest felt too big, like it had been pumped full of air, and his heart was overfilled with emotion. Harry wanted to spend all the years of his life beside him. Harry had found a comfort and a safety in his arms. Draco raised his wand, closed his eyes, and spoke the incantation. This time, though, when he said Expecto Patronum, Draco didn't only get silvery wisps and piteous sparkles. Instead, a mist of shining, sparkling magic emerged from his wand, filling the empty space that Harry had cleared. The cloud coalesced into a large, powerful form. It was a corporeal Patronus, and it was in the shape of a horse. Draco couldn't help but gasp at the sight. His Patronus was the very image of Hermes, the first horse he had ridden as a young boy. He still loved that animal more than any other he'd known in his life. "A fancy creature for a fancy man," Harry said behind him, his voice a gentle tease. Draco would have told him off for his cheek. He really would have done, except that he was still too overjoyed. He was riding high on the thrill of casting a Patronus and being in love. Harry wrapped his arms around Draco's waist, and together they watched as Hermes faded back into the ether. "You did it, Draco," Harry said, brushing a kiss onto Draco's blonde hair. "I always knew you would." "Thank you," Draco said, turning around to lean into Harry's embrace. "I couldn't have done it without you." Harry's arms around him were impossibly tight. "Together we can achieve anything we set our minds to, love," Harry said. "We're invincible." Draco buried his head in the crook of Harry's neck, loving and feeling loved in return. They had all their years of their lives in front of them, and all the time in the world. I Bloom, Just for You, by Ladderofyears, read by Mika. Potters, blooms, and bouquets, enchanted flowers for magical customers. Harry leant back, feeling satisfied. He wanted to take a final moment to admire the comfortable atmosphere within his new Diagon Alley emporium. Enchanted fairy lights sparkled here and there, giving the space a cozy, homey feel. Tall vases of flowers stood proudly on every surface, their gauzy shimmer a clue to their charmed nature. This was Wizarding London's very first enchanted flower shop, and today was Blooms and Bouquets' first day in business. The floor had been swept, the grouts and sickles counted into the till, and its pavement sign had been freshly painted with an elegant lily. It was stood beside him now, ready to be taken outside. There really wasn't much else for it, Harry thought, nervous noggles churning in his tummy. It really was time to open to the wizarding public. It was now or never. With a flick of his wand, Harry changed the sign from closed to open, and opened the door, pulling out the pavement side behind him. Blooms and Bouquets was a culmination of several years of hard work, from both Neville and himself. A fusion of his good friend's magi-herbological skills, and Harry's deep desire for a tranquil existence. He desperately craved a life that was the antithesis of the strife and danger of the Aurors, and there was nothing more calming than flowers. Nev and he had been lucky enough to find a wonderful location too. The Emporium was sandwiched smugly between Wizarding Wheezes and Magical Menagerie, so the shop would have plenty of passing trade. Harry lined up the pavement side nearby, skimming it lightly over a puddle. It seemed such a pity the day was drizzly. That he'd keep the customers at home, but Ron had promised to call in during his lunch, and suddenly, out of absolutely nowhere, a whirlwind of wizard came crashing onto Harry's left side, sending the pair of them stumbling. Harry managed to right himself, throwing his arms out to steady the lithe, woolen-coated man that had tripped into him. The wizard's arms were solid and muscular beneath Harry's hands. He carried an old-fashioned leather satchel that flew straight open, scattering parchments, quills, and books all over the wet pavement. "Steady," Harry said, laughing and riding them both. "Bit early in the day for falling into my arms, but I'm not averse." With a swell of his wand, Harry scooped up the wizard's runaway papers and accoutriored them into a pile in his hand. "Salazar," laughed the wizard, his voice a pleasant rumble. "I don't normally make a habit of running into chaps like this. Damp pavement, new boots. I do apologize. I've come this way every morning. I've done for years, but the fates were conspiring against me this morning. Slept in, sick owl. You know how it is. Looks like you're my hero today, Mr. Harry looked into the face of the wizard that stood before him. He had the same immaculate white blonde hair as ever, every strand still perfect and touchably soft. The man's eyes were the same slate grey too, but his face was perhaps less angular than it had been as a teenager. Of all the people in the entire Wizarding universe, the very last person that Harry had expected to run into on his very first day as a magical florist was Draco Malfoy. Potter. Harry Potter. But I don't think we need introductions, do we, Draco? Come on, let's get ourselves inside. These parchments will be ruined if we don't get a drying spell on them soon. Harry sat Draco down in one of the armchairs inside his small office while he fixed a drying and repair spell upon Draco's papers. They all appeared very ancient, covered in an indecipherable runic language that Harry didn't recognize at all. "This spell should take a few minutes to set," Harry said, looking up at Draco from the tiny sink. "Can I get you a cup of tea while you're waiting? I know you're already late, but—" "Please," Draco replied, gazing around the gently undulating mural of lavenders and pansies that Luna had hand-painted on his wall. "I'm already late, so a few more minutes can't possibly hurt." "Today is my first day," Harry said, tapping his wand on the teapot to fill it with steaming water. He carried it over to the small round table that he had seated Draco at, before placing it carefully down between the pair of them. Rummaging in the cupboard, Harry located the 2 teacups he wanted to. "And so, you've got the honor of being the first customer to enter Blooms and Bouquets." Draco sipped his tea and considered Harry's emporium. "A floristry business. I have to say, I am surprised, Harry. Like every wizard in England, I followed your exploits in the profit. Breaking that illegal potions ring, the magical beast fighting syndicate. You've been quite the hero over the last few years." Harry smiled, complimented that Draco had followed his cases. "Never liked the danger, though. Caught a muscle-melting hex in the leg a year or so back. I ended up in St. Mungo's for months while they grew most of my thigh back. I haven't been the same since. An aura that can't run has no place in the field, so I've had to rethink my life goals a bit." "But flowers? Your shop is quite beautiful, but I'm sure that the Potter I recall from school wasn't a particular herbology enthusiast." "Well, that was a result of my stay in the hospital," Harry replied, motioning with his hand at the multicolored blooms that surrounded them both. "I spent a lot of time observing my fellow patients, how their eyes lit up when their family and friends visited. The flowers they brought, well, it sounds daft, but I felt like they were a little piece of love that the visitors left behind." Draco looked on warmly, not embarrassed whatsoever by Harry's words. He took a swallow of his tea before he spoke. "That's not daft at all. You found your passion, Harry. That's what makes life worth living. I'm the professor of Viking and Celtic magic over at the Wizarding Department in the British Museum, and I adore it. When you enjoy your work, then every day is a joy. That's where I was headed when we had our little run-in a few moments ago." "Oh, yes, I know the place," Harry said. "I visited there a few times with Teddy. Those Egyptians certainly had some awe-inspiring magic. I'd love to visit there again." Harry was a little unnerved by how convivial this conversation with his old nemesis actually felt. Malfoy was as damnedly attractive as he'd been at school, but all the wizard's old haughtiness was entirely absent. Indeed, had this been one of Harry's rare wonder dates, he might have had high hopes for a second round. "Oh, I concur," Draco agreed, placing his empty teacup down with elegant fingers. "But right now, I'm more interested in these stunning blossoms. I've never quite seen anything like them before. Correct me if I'm wrong, but are they enchanted?" "They certainly are," Harry said, standing up. He padded over to a display of tulips and picked up a delicate stem. He passed it over to Draco, shyly. "These flowers have been charmed like a mood ring. They color to reflect the feelings of the owner's heart, so a wonderful gift for a chap to give his beloved." The 2 men watched as the bloom turned a subtle pink in Draco's hands. "That's exquisite," Draco murmured. "I've not seen such a sweet charm as this in a long time." Harry couldn't help but feel a pang of regret at the flower's coloring. Pink was the symbolic shade of romantic attraction. Draco obviously had an object of affection locked within his heart already. "The magic is all Neville's doing," Harry answered contemplatively. "He took the magi-herbology skills that he learned as a Hogwarts professor and fused them with Muggle flowers. All I ever did was take a floristry course with Luna." "Color me impressed," Draco said, picking up his pile of parchments and books before shrinking them to fit inside his satchel. "There's a certain special wedding that I'm attending in 2 months, and I'm in charge of making sure the flowers meet the bride's approval. She's quite the most splendid witch in all of existence, and I don't want her to enjoy anything less than the best. Potter, I do believe you might be the wizard for the job. I'm meeting her for dinner. May I buy a dozen of these tulips?" Harry agreed, simultaneously excited to have made a sale, but disappointed at Draco's words. The wizard was getting married. Malfoy was obviously in love, Harry thought, as he wrapped the blooms in gossamer tissue paper and pressed a Stay Fresh charm on them. It was a disappointing fact, but couldn't really be denied. Draco's eyes had lit up like everlasting flames when he talked about his bride. Harry wondered idly who the lucky witch might possibly be. It seemed a little odd that she was letting her fiancé arrange the flowers for their ceremony, but Draco and his darling were obviously both very aristocratic. Perhaps it was a pure-blood tradition. Harry supposed he'd have to learn these things if he was to succeed in the world of magical floristry. Draco handed over 3 gallons for the bouquet and took hold of them with a generous grace. "Their scent is just divine," Draco said, holding them close to his body. "Apologies once more for our little mishap outside, Harry. I do assure that I'm normally the epitome of grace, and thank you for saving my parchments. No doubt I'll see you again soon. I do hope that Cersei brings you every luck in the world with your new business." "Thank you," Harry replied. "I hope the bride enjoys her flowers." Harry watched as Draco turned and walked to the exit. Before he swung the door wide, he looked back at Harry once more. For half a second, Draco looked like he was about to say something else. But whatever it was, he seemed to think better of it. Draco gave an enigmatic half-smile, nodded goodbye, and then disappeared out into the rainy London morning. For the next hour or so, Harry couldn't help but dwell on his short interlude with Draco. The wizard was so changed from the arrogant schoolboy of the past, but Merlin, the same could be said of him. Harry imagined telling the hot-headed Gryffindor of his youth, of his flower shop fate. He doubted that the 17-year-old him would have given a particularly polite answer. Draco had obviously matured into a very affable, interesting and very attractive wizard. Perhaps, when Draco next visited, he might bring his bride-to-be. Harry vaguely remembered some talk in the Prophet about Malfoy getting engaged to Astoria Greengrass, but he thought all that gossip had died a death years ago. Or maybe it was a decorous youth, socialite, fresh from Hogwarts and promised to carry on the Malfoy name. The thoughts whirled around his brain, not giving Harry a moment's peace. That was definitely one thing that the 17-year-old him would still recognize. Draco Malfoy had always been a fixation that was hard to shift indeed. Still, this is his first day of business, and blooms and bouquets wouldn't run itself. True to his word, Ron soon came to visit, and he brought Hermione with him. Luna and Neville followed not long after. The excitement of the day soon overtook him, and Harry soon forgot about Draco's mysterious fiancée. He greeted a steady stream of customers as they browsed his flowers, gave advice and took orders at the till. By the end of the day, Harry felt exhausted, but also proud. If blooms and bouquets could maintain this level of interest, Neville and he would easily achieve their dreams. Draco returned early the following day. Harry had only just unspelled the door and taken out his pavement sign when the wizard strode into his shop, wearing the same warm woolen coat as the previous day. "And was your first day as splendid as you hoped, Harry?" Draco asked, casting his eyes over the freshly refilled stock. "I must admit, I recommended the place to a few of my colleagues. Everyone who saw the tulips loved them." We did sell out, Harry admitted, feeling more pleased than he cared to admit by Draco's patronage of his business. But more importantly, did the bride-to-be enjoy her flowers? She thought they were beautiful, Draco replied, finding Harry's eyes with his own. Draco looked very handsome today, Harry thought. He had wrapped a long navy scarf around his neck, which brought out the colour of his eyes. Even more attractive was the small blush that topped his cheekbones when he spoke. It was obviously cold outside. Harry tried not to stare. But she wasn't sure they were right for her wedding day. Tulips aren't the most traditional of wedding flowers, and well, we both thought those particular flowers were quite demonstrative. The bride wasn't overly keen on showing all of her feelings for her beloved to the whole world. Draco's words trailed off, and Harry watched, a little jealously, as his cheeks grew pinker still. It was blatant, Harry decided. The wizard before him was recalling the very strong reaction the tulips had the previous day, and his own very public show of attraction. Draco must be quite besotted with his mystery witch. Not to worry, Harry said brightly, hoping his smile wasn't as much of a grimace as it felt. He was, after all, a floristry professional, and selling flowers was his job. Neville and I designed the most perfect flower for a more traditional bride. He walked Draco over to a collection of immaculately sculpted roses, charmed a deep, passionate red. Allow me to show you the Infinity Rose, Harry said, carefully removing a stem from the vase and passing it to Draco. As long as the marriage remains true, this rose will bloom forever. The bride could have a rose from her bouquet on her dressing table for the rest of her life, and it'd never wilt or fade. A truly romantic gift. This rose is glorious, Draco admired, and I truly think that she'll love them. Can I buy a dozen to show her? I'm meeting her after work for wedding planning over wine and nibbles. I think she'll be awed by them. Harry agreed, and wrapped the roses ready for Draco to take away with him. This witch was really the luckiest lady in existence, Harry thought grumpily. He could only hope that she'd appreciated what a wonderful cat she'd gotten with Draco Malfoy. Draco returned for a third time the following day. Harry had only finished skulkifying the windows clean and topping up the greeting parchments when Draco walked through his door, making the bell ring cheerfully. You'll start to think I can't keep away, Draco said bashfully, entering Blooms and Bouquets with a clatter of boots on the polished stone floor. Harry watched as Draco spelled his hair neat and tidy. You'll have to excuse my appearance. It's a blustery day outside. You already looked great to me, Harry began, before mentally charming his mouth tight shut. After all, Draco was just being cordial. He didn't need to witness Harry's pathetically obvious crush. The man was engaged to be married for Merlin's sake. The pair of them were quiet for a long moment before Draco cleared his throat, casting his eyes all around the boutique. He appeared to want to look anywhere but in Harry's direction. The roses, Draco began, finally finding Harry's eyes, were a huge hit. The bride-to-be loved them immensely, and we've decided to use them in all of the wedding bouquets. But we needed something lighter to go alongside them. My girl wants classical, but also rustic and chic. What other flowers can you show me that will work well with roses? Harry knew precisely the flower that Draco ought to see. Indeed, they were his own personal favourites. Lilies, Harry replied, emphatically, walking Draco and he over to their prominent display. The pointed leaves of the flowers are a classic shape within a wedding bouquet. Their pinks and mauves will visually lighten up the red of the roses. And the best part of blooms and bouquets lilies, they're infused with amortentia. As Harry watched, Draco raised the lily to his nose and took a deep whiff. His eyes widened in surprise. Manifestedly, the scent was very familiar. What a wonderful, clever idea, Draco enthused, his features soft with pleasure. He breathed deeply and closed his eyes. I can smell broomstick oil and lavender, and the chocolate pudding that the elves used to make back home at the manor. There's something else there, something new, something floral. I just can't place it. It's so familiar. Harry shivered ever so slightly as he took the lily out of Draco's hand and took a deep breath himself. The amortentia smelt much the same as ever for him too, like treacle tart, clean bed linen and Earl Grey tea. But there was something new for him too, the smell of ancient, incomprehensible parchments and posh woolen coats. Salazar. The amortentia smelt like Draco. The question was on the very tip of Harry's tongue. What is it that you smell? But Harry couldn't find the words. The question tangled and twisted inside his mind, leaving him mute. Before him, Draco seemed to wake from his stupor and took 2 steps backwards, his pointy features a mask of surprise. That's an immensely powerful piece of magic, Draco stuttered out eventually, his face flooding with a deep pink flush. I'd like to take a dozen. For the wedding, of course. For the bouquets. For the wedding. For the bouquets. That was a clear message to stay professional. Harry took a deep breath, pulling air into his lungs over and over again until he felt like he could function reasonably once more. I'll wrap them up, Harry muttered, his voice full of fake joviality. I hope the bride likes them as much as you seem to, Draco. 3 galleons, please. It was an unsubtle dismissal of his customer. Draco placed the coins in Harry's hand and picked up his flowers. But then he wavered, waiting by the door in silence for what seemed like an age. Harry just wished that Draco would leave him in peace, even if only for a moment. He could hardly bear to look at Draco, even though he knew how terribly unfair he was being. It wasn't Draco's fault that Harry had fallen for him when he was already taken. When he was getting married. At length, Draco spoke. I'm sure that she will. Thank you, Harry. Draco's footsteps retreated, and it wasn't until the blooms and bouquets door had finally swung shut that Harry allowed himself to breathe once more. Harry slowly pulled out his pavement sign, outside into the thin morning sun. It was his 4th day in business, and blooms and bouquets had flourished more than Neville and he had dared to imagine. The Prophet was sending over a journalist to do a review, and they'd even scrawled a lucrative ministry contract. Harry knew that he should be beaming with happiness. He wasn't. All that Harry could think of was Draco's absence. 8:45 was usually the time that the blonde wizard walked past, his first customer of the day. Harry had even put off taking out the sign for a few minutes, in hopes of seeing Draco walking towards him. No doubt Draco would take to fluing into his museum. Easier than... That would be far easier than an awkward encounter with Harry each morning. Perhaps after Draco was married, he wouldn't even come through Diagon on his way to work any longer. But then suddenly, Draco was there, rushing down the lane and over the cobbles. The wizard grinned wildly, and he waved his arms. Papers threatened to fly out of his unpinned bag, and his hair was mussy and wild. "Harry!" Draco shouted. "I wanted to see you, but then I slept in." Draco halted himself only at the very last moment. "I took the lilies to Pansy last night. We love them. She's desperate for you to do the flowers for the wedding, and made me promise to talk to you immediately." Harry held the Emporium door out for Draco, a hot hour of disappointment running through his middle. Draco hadn't run all the way from his home for him. He'd only wanted to satisfy his fiancée. Pansy Parkinson. Harry might have known that she'd be the Golden Witch. Even at school, she and Draco had always been together. "I'm very pleased that your bride liked them," Harry said, arranging his face to look more professional than he felt. With a swirl of his wand, an order parchment and quill appeared on the small round table. "I'll just need to take a few details about the wedding. Date, location, and such like." Draco sat down beside Harry, his face confused. "Pansy's wedding is in 2 months, July 10th. She's getting married in the magical atrium at the British Museum. But you must know that Pansy isn't my bride, Harry. She's marrying Theodore Nott." Harry felt his whole body tremble in shock. Draco wasn't marrying. But he'd called Pansy his girl, called her splendid, and said he wanted her to have the very best. "I'm paying for the wedding," Draco said, pulling out a Gringotts bank book out from his satchel. He placed it on the table and tapped it with a finger. "That's my wedding gift, so take whatever you need. I'm determined to do everything right for Pans. She's closer to my heart than any sister, and I love her dearly. Couldn't marry her, though, Harry. I happen to prefer chaps." Draco opened the bank book. He took out a stiff envelope and passed it over to Harry. Written on the front, in glowing calligraphy script, were the words Harry Potter. "I was wondering if you'd do me the honor of attending the wedding, as my particular guest. You did say you wanted to visit my museum again. Maybe I'll even give you a bit of a tour, if we get a few spare minutes." "I can't think of anything I'd enjoy more," Harry replied. Draco gazed at him, his smile wide and genuine, and Harry felt his heart race in his chest. "And I promise you the flowers will be breathtaking." "If they are anything near as impressive as the florist, they will be," Draco said smoothly, writing his vault number on the order form. "Take whatever you need, Harry. I have to go to work, but dinner tomorrow. I can pick you up after work." "I'll count down the hours," Harry murmured, taking in Draco's delighted expression. "It's a date." Draco left then, leaving behind only the faint scent of parchment and a million excited imaginings for the future in Harry's head. Draco and he were only just beginning. After all, love was the one flower that you had to let grow.